I never thought a hiking trip in the Pacific Northwest would turn into one of the most unforgettable and unexpected weeks of my life. Honestly, I was just trying to get away from my own mess for a bit. The stress of a recent breakup, the overload of my job, and just the constant background noise of city life that never really lets up. So when I signed up for that guided tour through the Cascades, I figured it'd be a straightforward kind of vacation. Some fresh air, stunning views, and maybe a few good photos for Instagram. Simple, but right from the moment I met him, I knew this trip wasn't going to be like any other. His name was Aaron, and he was the guide assigned to our small group. Tall, with this easy smile that made you think he probably knew a lot more stories than he let on. He had this casual way of holding himself, like he was part of the forest itself, and when he talked about the trails or the wildlife, you could tell he wasn't just reciting facts, he was living it. I caught myself paying more attention to him than the map or the itinerary he was explaining. The thing was, Aaron's style was different from what I expected. He wasn't the kind of guide who stuck rigidly to the main trails or the pre-planned stops. Instead, he'd point out little hidden paths and shortcuts, telling stories about the locals who'd used those routes for decades, or the secret spots where the wildflowers bloomed just right. It felt like he was inviting us into a side of the mountains that most tourists never saw. And for me, that invitation was tempting in a way I couldn't immediately explain. By the second day, the group had started to follow along without question, trusting Aaron's instincts. But there was a moment, just after lunch one afternoon, when he glanced my way and said, "Hey, you want to see something special? Something off the usual path?" I hesitated, mostly because I was still the new guy, but his eyes made it impossible to say no. So we slipped away from the main trail together. He led me down a narrow, overgrown path that twisted beneath towering evergreens and mossy rocks. The sounds of the group faded behind us, replaced by the quiet rustling of leaves in a distant creek. It felt like stepping into a secret world that only the trees and a handful of people knew existed. That's when I realized this trip was about to become a lot more than just a hike. I don't know what I expected. Maybe just a quick detour and then back to the group. But Aaron's presence shifted something inside me. It wasn't just the scenery or the fresh air. It was the way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. Like he was holding back a story he was dying to tell. Or maybe like he was waiting for me to ask the right question. We reached a small clearing where sunlight filtered through the canopy, lighting up a patch of wild ferns and a tiny waterfall trickling over smooth stones. Aaron sat down on a fallen log and patted the spot beside him. "Most people never come here," he said, voice low. "It's quiet, peaceful, a good place to just be." I sat down, feeling the breeze lift my hair and the weight of the city slip away. For the first time in a long time, the knot in my chest loosened a little, and just like that, I knew the real journey was just beginning. I glanced over at Aaron, noticing the slight catch in his breath as he gestured toward the waterfall. "It's beautiful," I said, but honestly, I could barely focus on the scenery. There was something about this moment, about him, that made everything else fade into the background. He shrugged, a little shy, like he wasn't used to people saying stuff like that. "Yeah, it's one of my favorite spots. Not many people find it. I guess that's why I like bringing people here. It's like sharing a secret." That struck a chord with me. I'd always been the kind of guy who kept his cards close to his chest. Maybe that's why my last relationship had ended so messily. Never letting anyone really in. Always holding back. But here, in this quiet patch of wilderness, with Aaron sitting just a few feet away, I felt like the walls I'd built were starting to crumble. "So," I said, trying to keep my voice light but failing utterly, "how do you find these places? I mean, this isn't on any map I saw." He smiled. This easy, knowing smile that made my heart skip. Years of wandering, a lot of getting lost. Sometimes you just have to trust your gut. There was a pause, and then he looked at me like he was suddenly deciding something. "I want to show you something else tomorrow. It's not on the main route, but it's worth it. If you want." I didn't hesitate. Definitely. That night, sitting around the campfire with the rest of the group, I found myself distracted. I kept glancing over at Aaron, who was joking around and making people laugh, but every now and then, his eyes would meet mine, and that quiet connection would spark again. When the fire died down and most people had retreated to their tents, Aaron came over to mine. The air was crisp, the stars bright overhead. "Hey," he said softly. "Hope you don't mind, but I thought maybe we could talk. Just us." I shrugged, heart pounding. "I'm glad." We settled on a couple of logs not far from the fire circle's edge. For a while, neither of us said much. The night was alive with the sound of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. Finally, he broke the silence. "You don't have to pretend with me. I can tell you're carrying a lot." I swallowed hard. "Yeah, I guess I am. Broke up a few months ago. Thought getting out here would help me clear my head." I wasn't expecting this. I gestured vaguely between us. Aaron smiled, but it wasn't the same easy grin from earlier. It was softer, more sincere. Sometimes the best things come when you least expect them. I'm usually terrible at this, I admitted. Meeting people, opening up. But with you, it feels different. He reached out, brushing a stray leaf off my jacket. I feel it too, like there's something here worth exploring. I looked down at his hand for a second longer than necessary before meeting his gaze again. "Do you think it's crazy to feel this way after just a couple of days?" Aaron laughed quietly. "Maybe, but sometimes crazy is exactly what we need." The next morning we set out early, the group still groggy from the night before. Aaron led me away again from the main trail, weaving through dense trees and over moss-covered rocks. It wasn't long before we arrived at a ridge that overlooked a valley so green and vibrant it looked like a painting. "This is the place I wanted to show you," he said, his voice soft with reverence. We sat side by side on a flat rock, the sun warming us from behind. I felt my nerves settle. For the first time in what felt like forever, I was completely present. We talked about everything, our childhoods, our favorite music, the moments that shaped us. Aaron was an open book, and his honesty made it easier for me to share parts of myself I usually kept hidden. At one point, he reached over and took my hand. It was a simple gesture, but it sent a jolt straight through me. My heart hammered, and I struggled to keep my voice steady. "I don't want this to be just a trip." Neither did he. His eyes held no hesitation, only that same quiet certainty I'd seen all along. Over the next few days, we slipped away whenever we could, carving out moments just for the two of us. Sometimes it was a shared joke. Other times it was sitting in silence, letting the forest surround us like a shield from everything else. On the last night, as we packed up under a sky heavy with stars, Aaron pulled me close and whispered, "You changed my tour this week, took me off my usual path." I smiled. Maybe we both needed someone to show us a different way. And as we stood there in the dark, wrapped in something neither of us had planned but both of us wanted, I knew that getting lost wasn't so bad after all. Because sometimes, the best things happen when you stop following the trail everyone else is on. We packed up the next morning with a bittersweet feeling hanging over everything. The group was buzzing about the last leg of the tour, but between Aaron and me, there was this quiet, almost electric tension. Like we both knew things were shifting, but neither wanted to rush the moment. After breakfast, the hike back toward the trailhead was mostly uneventful, just the usual chatter and photo stops. But I found myself walking alongside Aaron more than anyone else, slipping into easy conversations that felt different from the usual small talk. It wasn't just the scenic views or the fresh air, it was the way he listened, really listened, like everything I said mattered. At one point, the trail narrowed along a steep ridge, and I caught myself looking down at the valley below, the mist curling between the trees. Aaron nudged me gently with his elbow. "You all right?" I nodded, but then the nerves hit me. "You ever wonder if you're just chasing something you can't have?" He looked at me, brow furrowed. "Like what?" "Like this," I said, motioning between us. "You're my guide. I'm just a visitor in your world. What if when the trip's over, this, whatever this is, just disappears?" Aaron's gaze didn't waver. "Then maybe we make sure it doesn't." His voice was low, almost a promise. I wanted to believe him, but the doubt was stubborn. We were from different places, different lives. This trip was a bubble, a brief pause before reality slammed back. Still, the way he said it, with that quiet confidence, made me want to try. Later that day, the group stopped for a break near a crystal-clear stream. Most people were sprawled out, chatting or checking their phones, but Aaron and I found a quieter spot upstream. The water was cold, and I dipped my hand in, watching the ripples catch the sunlight. So I said, trying to sound casual, "What made you become a guide? You seem like you could have done a million other things." Aaron shrugged, flashing that mischievous smile again. "I grew up around here. My family's always been connected to these mountains. It's home. Being a guide lets me share that with people who don't usually see this side of the world." He paused, then added, "Plus, I like the freedom. No cubicle, no clock to punch." I laughed. "Sounds like my kind of job." He looked at me, eyes softer now. "You ever think about running away? Leaving everything behind and just being somewhere new?" "God, yeah. More times than I could count. Maybe you should," he said. And it wasn't a question. I wasn't sure if he meant it literally or as some kind of metaphor, but it stirred something in me. The idea of wiping the slate clean, starting fresh with someone who understood, was intoxicating. The rest of the hike back to the trailhead passed in a blur. When we finally reached the parking lot, the group started gathering their gear, saying goodbyes with hugs and promises to keep in touch. I stood next to Aaron, reluctant to let go of the bubble we'd built. He cleared his throat. "So, what now?" I shrugged, heart pounding. "Honestly, I don't know. I wasn't expecting any of this, but I want to see where it goes." Aaron smiled, that same quiet confidence. "Good, because neither am I." Before I could say anything else, he leaned in, brushing his lips gently against mine. It was soft and tentative, like the moment before a trail splits and you have to choose which way to go. When we pulled apart, I found myself grinning like an idiot. "So what's the plan?" He shrugged again, but this time with a grin that matched mine. "We find a new trail. Together." Driving away from the mountains later that day, I stared out the car window, the towering trees fading into the distance. I wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I was excited to find out. Because sometimes, the best journeys don't follow the main trail. They're the ones where you take a chance on someone who shows you a path you never knew existed. The weeks after the trip were a strange mix of normal and new. Back in the city, my usual rhythm felt off, like I'd been rewired somehow. I kept replaying the moments with Aaron, the way he'd looked at me, the softness in his voice when we talked about running away, about starting fresh. It was like the trip had opened a door I hadn't known was there. We kept in touch, mostly through texts and the odd late-night call. At first it felt casual, like we were just checking in. But the more we talked, the more I realized I didn't want to treat it like some vacation fling. I wanted to know him. I wanted to see if the connection we'd sparked could survive the distance and the everyday grind. One Friday evening, after a particularly rough day at work, I found myself scrolling through my phone, caught between sending him a message or just giving up. Finally, I typed, "I'm coming back up next weekend. Think you could show me that secret waterfall again?" There was a pause, those long, agonizing seconds when you wonder if the other person feels the same way. Then, wouldn't miss it for the world. That weekend, I packed my bags with this mixture of excitement and nerves I hadn't felt in a long time. When I got off the train and saw Aaron waiting on the platform, his grin lit up the whole station. It hit me then. This wasn't just a fling or a quick escape. This was becoming something real. We didn't waste time with small talk. The moment I slipped on my hiking boots, Aaron pulled me toward the trailhead, and we were back in the forest, just like before. The trees felt like old friends, and so did he. As we walked, he reached out and laced his fingers with mine. It was such a simple thing, but it made my heart stutter. "How's the city treating you?" he asked, loud, exhausting, and honestly, a little lonely. I squeezed his hand. "Being here with you makes me forget all that." He smiled, that same quiet warmth I'd come to crave. Good, because I was hoping this could be more than just a weekend thing. I looked at him then, the way the sunlight caught the edges of his hair, the way his eyes held mine steady. "Yeah, me too." We reached the waterfall, and it was even more beautiful than I remembered. The sound of the water felt like a balm to everything inside me. We sat there for a long time, just talking about things we'd never said out loud before. Our fears, our hopes, the reasons we'd both been holding back for so long. At one point, Aaron took my face gently in his hands. "You don't have to do this alone anymore." Those words hit me harder than I expected. All the walls I'd built, all the doubts and fears, they started to crumble. I don't want to. After that weekend, things shifted. We started seeing each other whenever we could, carving out pieces of time between our lives that felt more alive than anything I'd known before. It wasn't always perfect. There were days when the distance felt like too much or when my old fears bubbled up, but there was always Aaron, steady and patient, reminding me that it was okay to take a chance. One night, about a month after my second trip, he invited me over to his place, a cozy cabin just outside the town where he'd grown up. I walked in and instantly felt at home. The walls were lined with old maps, photos of mountains and forests, and a few quirky pieces of local art. It smelled like pine and fresh coffee. We cooked dinner together, laughing over burnt garlic bread and spilled sauce. Afterward, we sat on the porch wrapped in blankets, watching the stars come out. Aaron pulled me close, resting his head on my shoulder. "I never thought I'd find someone who understands this part of me," he said quietly. "The part that loves being outside, that wants to explore and get lost." I traced circles on his back. "I'm glad you found me then, because I think I've been lost for a long time." He looked up at the sky, then back at me. "Let's promise to keep finding new trails, together." And that's what we did. We didn't rush, didn't force anything. We just kept walking. Sometimes off the beaten path, sometimes down roads we thought we knew, always side by side. Because love, I learned, isn't about following a map. It's about being brave enough to trust someone to walk with you into the unknown. We'd settled into a rhythm that felt right, even though our lives were still miles apart. Me in the city, him rooted in those wild, endless forests. Most weekends were spent driving up to Aaron's cabin, or sometimes him making the trip down to the city. Every visit was like opening a new chapter, and with every one, I felt less like the guy who'd come to escape, and more like the guy who'd found something real. But, like anything worth holding on to, it wasn't without its challenges. One cold Saturday afternoon, we were hiking a trail Aaron had been raving about for weeks. It was one of those hidden gems he'd discovered as a kid, barely marked on the map, with steep climbs and breathtaking views. We'd been hiking for hours, the kind of quiet where only the sound of our boots crunching leaves and the occasional bird call filled the air. We stopped at a ledge, overlooking a valley painted in autumn gold. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows, and everything felt perfect. Aaron was fiddling with his pack, pulling out a thermos of coffee. I watched him for a moment, how the light caught the edges of his face, the way his fingers worked quickly but carefully. Then, without warning, he looked up and said, "Can I be honest with you about something?" My heart skipped, but I nodded. "I'm scared," he said, voice low. "Scared that us, it's just going to be another thing I lose, that I get too close, and then it all falls apart." I was surprised. Aaron, the guy who seemed so sure of himself on the trail, the one who talked about freedom and new paths, was being vulnerable in a way I hadn't seen before. "I know what you mean," I said, stepping closer. "I'm scared too. Scared that once I leave here, I'll go back to feeling alone, that this feeling we have now is just temporary." He took my hand then, and it was like everything else. The cold, the fear, the doubts, just melted away. Maybe it's scary because it's real, because it matters. We sat there a while longer, the sky turning from gold to deep blue, holding onto each other as the world quieted around us. For the first time, the distance between our lives felt more like a challenge we could face together, not a barrier. A few weeks later, things got complicated. I was back in the city, and work had hit a brutal stretch. Late nights, constant calls, and the kind of stress that made me question everything. Aaron called me one evening, voice rough from a long day, and I could tell something was off. We talked for hours about the pressure, about the loneliness, about how hard it was to keep this relationship alive when we were living such different lives. There were tears, yes, and moments where I thought maybe we were just fooling ourselves. But then Aaron said something that stuck with me. "We don't have to have it all figured out right now. We just have to want it enough to try." That night, I realized that love isn't some fairy tale where things fall perfectly into place. It's messy, it's hard, and it demands more than just hope. It requires showing up, even when it's inconvenient or scary. So I did. The next time I was with Aaron, I surprised him with a small, beat-up journal. Inside, I'd started filling it with notes about our trips, the trails we'd taken, the moments that mattered. It was messy and imperfect, just like us. He looked at it with wide eyes and a smile that made my chest ache. "You're serious about this, aren't you?" "More than anything." That weekend, we explored a new trail together, one neither of us had been on before. We laughed when we got lost for a bit, our hands finding each other every time doubt crept in. At the summit, we looked out over a sea of trees stretching to the horizon, and Aaron pulled me close. "This," he said, "is where I want to be, with you, even if the path isn't clear." And I knew. I didn't just want this to be a series of stolen moments, a detour from my life. I wanted us to build something that lasted, no matter how hard or uncertain the trail ahead might be. Because sometimes the best journeys don't have a map. They're the ones you make together, one step at a time. Not long after that summit moment, I realized things were about to shift again, but this time in a way I hadn't fully anticipated. See, up until then, our relationship had been a kind of beautiful escape, a breath of fresh air from the noise and chaos of my city life, and the solitude Aaron's forest home sometimes imposed. But as the months rolled on, the balance started to feel fragile, like a tightrope stretched between two very different worlds. One chilly Friday evening, after a long day at work that left me feeling drained and a little defeated, I got a text from Aaron. "Can we talk? I think I need you to really hear me." My stomach twisted. We'd always been honest, but there was something serious in those words. I agreed, and we arranged to meet that weekend at his cabin. When I arrived, the sky was a dull gray, the kind of weather that settles into your bones. Aaron was waiting on the porch, his expression softer but heavier than usual. He greeted me with a hug that felt both warm and tentative, like he was bracing for what was coming next. We settled into the living room, the fire crackling between us. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Aaron took a deep breath. "I've been offered a chance to lead a new tour program for my company," he said slowly. "It means more responsibility, more travel, maybe even some time away from the cabin. It's a big opportunity." I nodded, understanding the significance but feeling a knot tighten in my chest. "That sounds amazing. You've earned it." "Yeah, but," he hesitated, "it also means our time together might get even more complicated. I worry we'll drift apart." I reached across the gap and took his hand. "We've come this far. I don't want to lose what we have because of distance or schedules." Aaron looked at me, his eyes searching. "Do you think we can handle it? The unpredictability?" I squeezed his hand. "I want to try. I want us to try." That weekend, we talked about everything. Our fears, hopes, and what we were willing to give up or sacrifice for us. It wasn't easy. There were tears, moments of uncertainty, and conversations that stretched into the early morning. But beneath it all was this unshakable desire to hold on to what we'd built, even if the path ahead was rough and uncharted. The weeks that followed were a test of that commitment. Aaron's new role meant more time away, sometimes for days, sometimes weeks. I stayed busy with work, but the silence left by his absence was hard to fill. I'd catch myself scrolling through our old messages, rereading the journal I'd given him, longing for the next time we'd be together. When we did reunite, whether it was at his cabin or in the city, it was like no time had passed at all. But the goodbye moments, those were the hardest. One evening, after a weekend together, I drove him to the airport. The cold air bit at my skin as we stood by the curb, the hum of travelers around us. Aaron looked exhausted but happy. "I hate goodbyes," he admitted, pulling me close. "Me too," I whispered, "but it's not forever." He smiled, brushing his lips over mine. "Promise me something?" "Anything. That we'll keep choosing each other, even when it's hard." I nodded, the words catching in my throat. "I promise." As his plane took off, I felt a mix of pride and ache. We were building something that required patience and faith, a relationship that didn't fit into neat boxes or easy timelines. One night, months later, Aaron surprised me by showing up at my apartment unannounced. I was sitting on the couch, half watching a movie, when there was a knock at the door. Opening it, there he was, smiling like he'd just found the missing piece of his puzzle. "I missed you." he said simply, stepping inside. That weekend, we spent every moment together. Cooking, hiking a new trail outside the city, just being. It was messy and beautiful, filled with laughter and quiet talks under the stars. At one point, we sat on a park bench, the city lights twinkling around us. Aaron took my hand and said, "I don't want to live two separate lives anymore. I want to build one together." My heart pounded. I want that too. We talked late into the night about what that could mean. Moving, compromises, the unknown. It wasn't a perfect plan, just the beginning of one. That moment felt like crossing into new territory, scary but thrilling. Because sometimes love means stepping off the trail you know and trusting that, together, you can find your way through whatever comes next. A few months after that night on the park bench, Aaron and I made a quiet but huge decision. We would close the distance. He found a job in the city, one that still left room for the mountains he loved, and I started looking at neighborhoods where we could build a home together, one that blended our worlds without losing either. Moving in was a whirlwind of boxes, laughter, and late nights figuring out which trail maps to hang on the walls. It wasn't perfect. There were moments when the stress of change crept in, or when we caught ourselves slipping into old patterns of doubt. But those moments never lasted long because we chose to face them as a team. One evening, a few weeks after we'd settled in, Aaron and I took a walk through a nearby park, the city quieting down around us. The air was crisp, and the glow from street lamps cast soft shadows. We stopped by a small pond where the water reflected the stars above, and Aaron pulled me close. "I've been thinking a lot about those trails we used to hike," he said. "How none of them were straightforward, but they were ours." I smiled, feeling the warmth of his hand in mine. "I know. And I'm glad we took the detours." He looked at me, eyes steady and full of something I recognized as home. "Me too. You showed me that getting lost isn't so bad when you have someone with you." In that quiet moment, the noise of the city felt miles away, and the weight I'd carried for so long lifted. I realized that love, like those hidden trails, doesn't always come easy or follow a clear path. But it's real because you choose to keep walking together. We stood there for a while, hands intertwined, knowing that whatever the future held, we'd face it side by side. And honestly, that was more than enough. Because sometimes the best journeys don't have maps or signs. They have two people willing to explore the unknown and trust the path they make along the way.